Think of war not as isolated battles or forgotten battleships lost to time, but as the drumbeat behind the rise and fall of empires, nations, and entire civilizations. Wars redraw borders, topple dynasties, shift global power, reorder societies, and often leave legacies that shape human life for centuries. When you truly grasp why wars start, how they unfold, and what they leave behind, you begin to understand everything from why certain nations dominate the map today, to why some states collapsed or transformed. If you care about history, deep history, seriousness matters. Stay with me, and I'll walk you through how major wars form, why they erupt, what they do to societies, and why studying them matters just as much now as ever. War, in analytic terms, is more than a clash of armies. It is an institutionalized conflict between political groups or states of substantial power and duration. Wars seldom begin for a single reason. Rather, they erupt when multiple pressures converge. Competition for resources or territory, economic ambitions, political power struggles, ideological or religious differences, nationalism or the urge for dominance, and sometimes the desperation born of social, economic, or demographic stress. At their worst, wars become sweeping upheavals, global calamities that drag entire regions, continents even, into conflict. At their root, wars are human, driven by greed, fear, ambition, resentment, ideology, and survival instincts. Understanding those root impulses gives clarity. Wars are rarely acts of impulsive violence alone, but outcomes of long-term structural pressures, shifting alliances, and political dynamics. Not every conflict in history qualifies as a major war. What makes a war major is a combination of scale, participants, stakes, and consequences. Major wars often involve multiple powerful states, vast armies or coalitions, global or regional allies, economic mobilization, far-reaching political and social upheaval, and outcomes that reshape maps, societies, and future conflicts. Take World War I from 1914 to 1918. Its causes included militarism, a web of defense alliances, imperial rivalry, nationalism, and political tensions. Really a complex tangle that pushed Europe and, well, much of the world into catastrophe. The consequences were sweeping: collapse of old empires, redrawing of borders, political revolutions, economic turmoil, and of course, demographic loss. Then there is World War II, from 1939 to 1945. It was born from unresolved tensions after the First World War, the rise of aggressive ideologies and fascist regimes, economic collapse, imperial ambitions, and political instability. The war decimated societies and populations, triggered genocide, massive destruction, and honestly, transformed global power structures forever. What ties such wars together is not just the number of battles or combatants, but their function as world shapers. These are wars that altered the political map, shifted empires, changed the economic order, and, left scars and lessons for humanity. Major wars leave far more than physical destruction. They dismantle empires and dynasties, redraw national borders, reshape economies, alter social structures, prompt migrations, create refugee flows, cause demographic collapse, and sometimes trigger revolutions or ideological shifts. Wars also accelerate technological and social change. The demand for war-related production, logistics, medicine, communications, strategy, and mobilization often pushes societies to innovate, but at massive human and moral cost. After wars, many societies must rebuild from ruins, which sometimes leads to political instability, shifts in governance, or reordering of global influence. For historians and researchers, wars mark turning points, pivot moments where one era ends and another begins. Knowing how and why a war started helps explain why empires collapsed, why new nations emerged, why certain borders exist today, why populations migrated, why cultures blended or clashed. For anyone trying to understand current geopolitics, borders, alliances, resentments, regional tensions, major wars are not relics, they are continuing echoes. If you want to treat wars as more than stories, as keys to understanding human society, start by mapping the structural causes before the fighting began. Study the economic pressures, resource scarcity, colonial ambitions, trade rivalries. Look at political systems, alliances, treaties, mutual defense pacts, ideological blocs, succession crises, and examine social pressures, nationalism, class tensions, ethnic or religious divisions. Then follow the sequence. What was the trigger event? For some wars, a single assassination, a political decision, a border dispute, but always in the context of deeper pressure. Observe how alliances, mobilization, ideology, public sentiment, and resource mobilization shaped escalation. Compare with earlier wars to see patterns, continuities, changes. So, finally, let's bring it to the aftermath. How did borders shift? How did societies cope? And what long-term changes occurred politically, economically, and demographically? That method, cause leading to trigger, then to war, and finally to consequences, well, it really gives clarity, depth, and insight. For students of history and geography, understanding major wars means, well, understanding why our world map looks the way it does. It means deciphering why some nations vanished, others emerged, why alliances formed, why modern nations began where they did, and how global power shifted over centuries. For documentary makers, researchers, or storytellers, major wars offer layered narratives, not just battles, but human stories, political intrigue, societal collapse and rebuilding, ideological conflict, and societal transformation. For survivalists or, strategic thinkers, studying wars really helps anticipate how resource scarcity, political tension, alliance dynamics, and economic stress, all those factors that aren't just stuck in the past, might influence future conflicts. It definitely sharpens your understanding of just how fragile peace can be, how quickly alliances can shift, and how societies might break under pressure or, well, adapt during a crisis. Major wars, they're not relics of some distant past. They're actually living skeletons in the architecture of our modern world. Their bones form borders, their wounds still shape societies, and their echoes, well, they resonate every time nations clash. Studying them with seriousness, rigor, and context is absolutely essential for anyone who wants to understand history, power, human nature, and, honestly, where we might be heading next. If you found this guide valuable, make sure to subscribe for more deep dive history content. And share it with fellow history buffs, researchers, or just anyone who cares about understanding the forces that have forged, and might still forge, our world. In some distant year, long before people flew across continents or crowded into megacities, a whisper traveled along trade routes and armies. A sickness that came fast, spread faster, and left fear in its wake. Communities collapsed into grief, towns emptied, economies stalled. And sometimes, entire regions felt like the world was ending. That sickness was influenza. Not the mild seasonal inconvenience most of us think of today, but a deadly pandemic force shaping history. If you want to understand how disease can reshape civilization, or how a single virus can redraw borders, topple power, and leave scars across generations, stay close. Because the story of influenza as a pandemic is one of humanity's harshest teachers. Long before we had microscopes, vaccines, or public health protocols, influenza, or illnesses very likely equivalent to it, swept across continents. One of the earliest widely documented flu pandemics occurred in 1580, when a wave of severe influenza moved from Asia to Europe and Africa, riding on trade caravans and maritime routes. In that outbreak, entire cities fell ill in a matter of weeks, thousands died, and the disease was so universal that historians noted almost everyone was infected or sick. Centuries more of trade, migration, war and exploration meant every few decades another pandemic could arise. The constant mixing of peoples, merchants, soldiers, sailors, created perfect conditions for a virus to spread globally. By the 19th century, with faster ships and railways linking every continent, influenza outbreaks could circle the globe in months. Among those 19th century pandemics, the outbreak of 1889 to 1890 really stands out. Often called the Russian flu, this pandemic moved rapidly from Asia into Europe and then overseas, affecting populations across continents in just a matter of months. Estimates suggest global fatalities around 1 million. In a world without antibiotics or modern hospitals, that number devastated entire communities. This pandemic illustrates what happens when human mobility intersects with a novel influenza virus. People travel, carry infection unknowingly, and the disease leaps from one region to another. For historical and survival-oriented observers, that remains a chilling and realistic lesson. Then came what many call the mother of all flu pandemics, the 1918 to 1919 pandemic, also known as the Spanish flu pandemic. The responsible virus, a strain of influenza A H1N1, spread globally, infecting roughly a third of Earth's population. That's almost 500 million people. Of them, an estimated 25 to 50 million died. And honestly, some estimates even push higher. What made this flu particularly terrifying was not just its spread, but its behavior. Unlike usual influenza outbreaks that tend to hit the youngest and oldest hardest, the 1918 pandemic killed many healthy young adults between 20 and 40, a demographic ordinarily least vulnerable to such infections. The pandemic moved in waves. The first wave, in early 1918, appeared milder, but as the virus mutated, later waves became far deadlier. Shortly after infection, victims could collapse into severe pneumonia. Death could follow within days. Communities were overwhelmed. No antivirals existed, no effective treatments, no vaccines. Medical systems collapsed under the weight of the sick. Control measures were primitive: isolation, quarantine, limiting public gatherings in some places, but unevenly enforced, unevenly effective. For many societies, the 1918 flu was, well, absolutely catastrophic. It disrupted economies, the labor supply, families, and even war efforts. And, in one really grim statistic, in the United States alone, about 675,000 people died. After 1918, humanity did not leave influenza behind. The virus evolved, resurfaced, and struck again. In 1957 to 58, the Asian flu pandemic, caused by influenza A subtype H2N2, swept the globe, causing an estimated 1 to 4 million deaths worldwide. These subsequent pandemics were, less devastating compared to the catastrophe of 1918, in part because medical science advanced. Vaccines, better hygiene, antibiotics for secondary infections, and improved diagnostics all helped. Still, flu pandemics remained capable of causing widespread mortality, social disruption, and, lasting damage. From the ancient 1580 pandemic to 20th century waves, influenza really demonstrates a repeating pattern. A novel virus emerges to which human populations have little or no immunity. It spreads quickly across travel routes and dense communities, and it hits hardest where sanitation, public health or healthcare access are weak. For historians, epidemiologists and survival-minded communities, these lessons are still relevant. Because of the unpredictable nature of the virus, its ability to mutate and produce new variants, influenza pandemics remain, inevitable. Applying this knowledge in real life or low-resource settings means preparing on multiple levels. First, invest in sanitation, hygiene, clean water, and basic community health education. Clean living conditions really do reduce vulnerability. Second, develop systems to detect early outbreaks. Community monitoring, local clinics, communication networks, early detection and isolation save lives. Third, stockpile and maintain access to essential medical supplies. Masks, disinfectants, antibiotics for complications, and basic supportive care. Fourth, use the lessons of history to inform communal discipline during outbreaks, limiting public gatherings, protecting the most vulnerable, elders, malnourished, immunocompromised, and offering care and support without panic. For survivalist communities, or, those living in remote or rural regions especially, understanding influenza's history means building resilience not just with weapons or supplies, but with knowledge. It's really about avoiding overcrowding, maintaining good hygiene, keeping an eye on newcomers, managing sickness carefully, and respecting quarantine when it's needed. When we study influenza as a pandemic across centuries, what really emerges is a pattern of vulnerability, adaptation, collapse, and recovery. Societies recovered, new public health measures, sanitation, vaccine research, health systems evolved. But, the scars remained: demographic change, loss of trust, cultural shifts, even migrations. Yet within that history lies hope. Humanity learned to fight, communities reorganized, medicine advanced, and each time survivors carried knowledge forward, building stronger defenses. That legacy is ours now, whether we live in crowded urban centers or remote rural villages. If you care about global health, about survival, or just history, influenza's pandemics offer a brutal but honest teacher. They remind us that humanity is powerful, but not invincible. That knowledge, preparedness, community, and solidarity matter more than ever. If this deep look into influenza as a pandemic resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Share this with fellow history lovers, community leaders, survival-minded friends. Let's keep studying the past, learning from it, and preparing wisely for whatever may come.